welcome to what? Okay. All right, welcome to the front end workshop. Hope you guys all enjoyed the back end one in the morning. And here's the URL for the slides. It's also up on the whiteboard for those of you in person. And let's get started. So before we get into React, we'll have to talk a little bit of basic JavaScript and HTML and CSS. So that'll be the first part of this workshop. And then we'll go into React and build a little website. Cool. So JavaScript basics. So in JavaScript, this is how you create variables and constants. You use the var keyword if you want to create global variables. But usually if you want block scope variables, so variables that's only going to be used between curly braces, then use the let keyword. And then if you want to create a constant, then use the const keyword. And as you'd expect, it's a constant, so you won't be able to change it. Cool. Data types. So JavaScript is dynamically typed. So that means we don't have, so if you guys are familiar with C or Java, you would have to declare the type of a variable first before you can create it. But in JavaScript, we can just set it to a number or a string or like an array here. And in JavaScript, we can also create objects. So here we're creating a person object with the first name, last name, their age. And then we can also include functions in the object as well. So like this. And to access items in this object, you would just use the dot. So if you're familiar with structs in C or objects in Java, it's quite similar. And then functions, there's actually quite a few ways of dealing with functions in JavaScript. This is probably the one that's the top one is probably the most similar to other languages. We declare a function, the name, the inputs, and then you do things. You can also declare them as function expressions. So instead of declaring it as a function, you can see that we're declaring it as a constant, giving it this name, and then the function here. For this workshop, you'll probably see me use arrow functions the most. So it's like a shorthanded version of function expressions, and you have the inputs here, and then you have an arrow to indicate, I guess, like, take in these inputs and then do this. And you can also have single line functions. We might see a little bit of that today as well. But they're basically arrow functions, but what needs to be done is quite small. So we can just put it in one line like this. Well, any questions so far? Cool. So in JavaScript, we can also have callbacks. So these are, so for example, when you run a function, and then at the end, when you finish running that function, you want something to happen, be it like another function, for example. Well, in this case, it will be another function. But basically, say we have this function, we want it to do something, and then at the end of it, we want it to call a specific function. Then we can pass that specific function in as an argument as of a callback function. And then at the end of your code, you would call the callback function. So this, and to use it, so for example, if we want to run function, we give it its input, and then we can either pass in the name of a predefined function, or we can pass in a new function, like declared, like how we're doing with arrow functions here. And so JavaScript, or a lot of web development, requires you to use this promise feature or async and await. so this is one way of doing it, and it's the one I'm most comfortable with because it's the most similar to the languages I use. But there's another way of doing it where you declare a promise and then you would call that function and then do dot then blah blah blah. I find that a bit confusing to read, so this is how I prefer to write my async functions. And async functions, they basically let you wait for something while the rest of the program goes on. So for example, we need some time-consuming operation, but we don't want that time-consuming operation to block our whole website. We don't want the whole website to freeze while we wait for this function to finish running. Then we use the await keyword for it. Cool. So moving on to HTML and CSS. For those of you who've done foundations of computing, you would have seen a little bit of HTML, but let's just have a look at it with this online HTML viewer. Just copying some HTML. So every HTML document, it starts with the doc type HTML and opens with the HTML tag and closes it with the HTML tag as well. They're basically, so every website, they're basically HTML documents, and then your browser translates that into whatever you're seeing. So, so the header, this bit would be information about this browser, which won't actually get shown here, but the page title would become whatever the tab is called. And then in the body is what will actually get rendered. So we can see here that we have a header called heading, and it's shown as a heading. And then the P tag denotes paragraphs. You can have multiple of them. And if we just play around with it, you can see that it's adding paragraphs when we add another section of that. UL, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's like an indication of lists. And in each list, we have list items. So here we have 1 and 2, and you can see that reflected here in dot points. And at the end, you can also insert things like images like this. But as you can see, it's not a very nice looking website at the moment. And that's what we use CSS for. And CSS basically takes in, well, HTML uses CSS to help make websites look better. And to be honest, I really don't like dealing with CSS, but basically we have some HTML code here. This is just a website. I've got the link in the slides, and you guys can play around with this. But this is quite useful to see, to show you guys like what each of those CSS things can do. So here we have some HTML code so this section is what's getting rendered. And if we look at this section, so div class equals flex container, that means that we're using this CSS flex container class to render this piece of information. And right now it looks like this, but we can play around with it. For example, if we change the background color to red, you can see that it gets changed. If we add something like, instead of rows, we want it in columns, then flex direction. and we run it, it becomes a column. There's a bunch of things you can do with it. And I don't really remember all of the CSS commands. So Google is your best friend. But basically one thing that I got confused quite a lot when I used CSS at the start was the difference between margin and padding. So when we have a CSS div, oh, where is it? So if we just go back to this website. So margin is basically if we put in a margin, you can see that it basically prevents other things being rendered within 10 centimeters of it. And you can see that the box size kind of changed. Might be more obvious if we make it 100. Whereas, what was the other one? Whereas padding, yep. Padding is basically the amount of space you have inside your div with before we can start rendering things. So that's something to keep in mind. And border is basically the border between the div and the rest of your website. Cool. Any questions? All right. Moving on to React. So why React? So as we've seen previously, if we just have all of this information in one page, we can't really do much of it with it. You can't really like call functions through this, or I guess reuse any of this code elsewhere. Whereas React, it provides you with tools to integrate JavaScript into web page rendering. And it also breaks down web pages into smaller components that you can reuse these smaller components in different parts of the web page. So if you just use HTML and CSS, I believe if you change some values in your website, the whole page will get re-rendered. Whereas in React, if you change the state of some values, only that component that you changed gets re-rendered. So you don't get like whole page refreshes. And it also there's also a lot of pre-made assets that a lot of people have put on the internet that we can use. We're not going to use any of it for this workshop, but there's just a bunch out there. React is made by Facebook, but I think now it's open source and you can find all the documentations here. And if you're using React, a good tool to use is the React Developer Tool extension on your browsers. And I'll just show you guys, I guess, so by the end of this workshop, we want to make a website that looks like this, and we can, so this is what Prashansa and Jennifer did it in the morning with the backend, and we're going to connect up this website with the backend, be able to do things with it. For example, if we want to delete this, you can see that it's gone. And we can add stuff in here as well. Not sure if we'll have enough time to go through the ad, but I'll try and run through everything. And what I wanted to show you guys, yes, was the React Developer Tool. So when you go into inspect on whatever web page you're using, if it is a website made with React, you can go into components, and it basically lists down all the components that you have, along with all the values of each component as well. So that's something useful. And lastly, before we start making the app, so to initialize a React project, you would need to first install Node.js. I believe there's Mac and Windows versions. And then after you've done that, you want to go into whichever folder you want to create your app in. And then in the terminal, you want to type npx create React app. I've already done that beforehand because it takes a bit of time sometimes. And once you've done that, you would end up with something. You would end up with something like this. So ignore the workshop content folder. We would end up with this React recipe app folder. And don't worry too much about public and no modules for now. And we probably won't really go into it today either. But under source is basically all the code for your website. It's running. And to run your code, you want to be in this folder where all of this information is. And if you do npm start, it will start the website in a new tab. And this is just the default React website. Once you initialize it, this is what you get when you do npm start. And if we start editing things in app.js, then that would get transported through to the app. So let's start doing that. Don't worry about this bit here. This is just like where all my notes are. But all right, let's copy this over. So right now, oh no. So first we're going to import React into our app. And then we're going to be using functional components. So every component is going to be a function. There's also something called class components, which I think is a little bit heavier and not as often used these days. And then here at the end of our function, we have a return statement, and this is basically what is getting returned from, or this is what is going to get rendered into our app. So if we save these changes, it'll automatically follow through on the React app. And you can see that what we have in this div, hello, is now showing on our app. And we can also make our page look cooler. So we can add style to it. So this is kind of like using CSS without creating a CSS file for it. And you can just insert CSS stuff in here. Later on, we will be using CSS, but this is just to show you like this, the most generic way, most basic way of doing this. And now if I save this, you can see that I've changed the background color. I've also added some padding at the top. So you can see that the background color of my app has changed to a nice shade of purple. And the hello is no longer at the very top of the very top of the web page. And instead there's like a little bit of gap in there. Cool. So that's all nice and done. Let's move on to actually making the website look a bit more similar to what our end result is going to be. And so firstly, let's create our first component. And to do that, we want to create a new folder called components. And then under there, we're going to create our header.js. So we're going to create a header first. And I'm just going to copy some code over. But basically, again, we are importing React. And then every time we want the header, we return something like, we return this. And this looks like HTML, but it's actually JSX, but you can treat it like HTML. The difference is instead of class, you have to use class name. And now that we've created this component, we want to put it back into, so if we just save this now, nothing will, there won't be any changes because our app.js doesn't really know about this new component yet. So we got to insert it back into app.js. So let me just copy some more code. So now instead of our hello, we're going to put in this code here. And to insert a component in there, we just create this, we just open with the, what are those called? Triangle brackets. And put in the name of the component. But because this is another component, we actually have to import it as well. So you would do import header. It automatically does it for you. But now if we save it and go here, you can see that we have our header, but we kind of, as you can see, it's not nicely in the middle of the web page. So we're going to create, oh wait, no, that's because I made a CSS, half copied, half made a CSS file. And that's the CSS file we're going to be using. If we save that, it should look better. Yeah. And that's because previously it was trying to find the container CSS, but it didn't exist. But in the container, we're basically saying we want to center this. We want to center all of the header and a bunch of other information about it, about how it looks. But don't worry too much about it. You can always Google it. Cool. Now that we have the header, just close some tabs. Now that we have the header, we want to, let's create this list of recipes. Right now it's not connected to the backend, and I don't, I'm gonna put in some dummy data first before we, to just get the app running, and then we can connect to the backend afterwards. Yep. So firstly, let's grab some dummy data. Again, I'm gonna be copying existing code. So every React component, they can have states. And in this case, we're going to use the list of recipes as a state of the app component. And then set recipes is going to be a function that you call to change the contents of the recipe. And use states, oh, I need to import that. Yeah. Use state is basically the default. So inside use state, you put in the default value of this state. So that's just some dummy data. It won't show up right now. We need to create places for it to put this data first. So let's make another component called, and the component is going to contain this whole list of all the recipes. Let's call it recipe list.js. And again, I'm just going to copy some code over. I'll come back to this, but before that, let's create the individual boxes of recipes first. So make a new component. So, yep, this is, yep, so this is some code that will get us the whole box of recipes. And so for every box, we want to pass in a recipe object. And each of these objects, we want to have a name and an ingredient and a method. And to pass that in, we're going to pass it in through the recipe lists. So under recipe list, this is like under recipe list, we're going to pass in. So this is the list of all the recipes, and this is how you will loop through all the elements in the recipes and then pass them into our recipe box component individually. And don't worry too much about like all this code. You guys will get a copy of I think, do they have the access to, yeah. You guys already have the access to the GitHub repo, but basically, I guess just think about it as we're passing data into smaller and smaller components, and eventually we'll end up using these data to make these elements show up. So now that we have this recipe list component ready, we want to put it into our application. And firstly, we'll have to import it. And then we want it under the header. So here we can just put recipe list. And to pass in the recipe list, you would do recipes equals what we have already defined here. So recipes. Cool. Now, if we refresh the page, you can see that we have our all the recipes that we have put in this dummy data is now showing up on our website. Cool. Any questions so far? So we're passing in this recipes that's in the app.js into our recipe lists component, which then divides that into smaller recipe box components. And these are the individual recipe boxes. So right now we're just using static data that we have defined here. But if we want to connect it to the database, we would have to use the fetch function that is built into React. So again, I just copy some stuff over. So first, let's talk about useEffect. So useEffect is a function that is going to get called once all of your components successfully mounted on the on your React app. And so basically you can kind of think of it as something that will get called immediately. And we also have to import that. So use effects. And this is how you would fetch something from the backend. So we would use the async and await keywords that we talked about before. And fetch is the function that you would use to call a URL. And I had to change some of the configs, but we have our server, which Prashanta has created in the previous tutorial, running on port 8000. So you could also just do local host 8000, but in this case, where is it? Yeah. So, but instead I put that value, I want to put that value in here as a variable so that I don't have to like type the same URL over and over again, and it can instead get reused. So in our package.json, we copy over, so the variable would be called proxy, and then in here you put your base URL. And this way, fetch would just slap the base URL in front of the get all function that, the get all API. So that's our function. The reason I put it outside of useEffects is because I will probably end up using this function multiple times rather than as soon as the page loads. But in useEffects, we basically call the fetch recipe function, and it fetches a bunch of recipes from the API. And then we're going to set the recipe so which would be this constant here, or this state here, as the recipe that we just have fetched from the API. And now we can just delete all of this. We don't need the dummy data anymore. Now we save it. Oh no. What's happening? Feel like I'm forgetting something.
We have the backend server running.
Yeah. Yeah, it's running. Give me a second. Little cheat. Oh God, I have no clue what's happening. Probably something stupid, to be honest. So it's saying that the length of recipes is 0 at the moment. It's gonna cost a lot good. Oh. Oh, okay, interesting. JSON parse error.
Shouldn't be 3,000.
Yeah. That's working. Wait, let me just double check with my index. Wait, where is it? Yeah, it's working. Yeah. Line 1, column 1 of the JSON data.
The first ID.
Oh, maybe.
Do you want to compare this with the code that you know for sure works? And just
I think you might just have to be like,
have a look through it.
No, the ID fine.
Yeah.
Where is it? And it should be passing in, right? Because it showed up before, right? So it should be
the API works okay.
yes.
Your app, like the proper app, that still works, right? Like,
Yeah, that still works.
where is it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, right.
Do you want to just copy and paste from that? It might be just like a
I
small
think
error or something.
this is literally copy paste.
I know, but like directly from that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did that. Then they just got like.
It's the same. Okay, I think it's the parse error that's throwing something, but I have no clue what parse error is.
So anyway, you can print it out in the front end, just like print out all of it, all the thing that you retrieved from the.
Yeah, I did try to console log it. Nothing's logging. That's really I feel like it's something really stupid.
It could be, yeah.
It's
Maybe I try. That's how I.
Rotate this bit for one. Right.
Legit to say,
Yeah,
Well,
it
that's
says loading, so
Oh,
that
it's
if we don't have any recipe, it should say loading. Console log of res. Good.
surely you did that to Sarah.
Oh, that's data. Where am I? Yes. I think nothing's getting logged because we're getting into this issue.
Do you want to just like close down the backend and restart it? Because
No, but backend works though.
I know,
Right.
Do you have two ports opening at the same time? That's what I do.
I don't.
Okay.
And the original one's running on 3000.
Yeah. So weird.
That is interesting. Why is res not even logging? Is it getting into an error before it can even wait? Where am I? Not this. Did I console log here instead of? Oh no. Okay. I am dumb. That's the response that we're getting. And then let's log data as well. Wait, so data's the one that's not logging. So response is getting logged, the data isn't. So it's probably this line that's throwing some weird issue.
Does that mean to extract the JSON out of the res?
Yeah, sure.
But isn't it not already coming in as an JSON file?
I think it's the JSON element.
Okay.
Man, what is this?
It's not a problem that you have two front ends accessing the same backend, right?
No, that should not be a problem.
Okay.
Wait, no, it's this one.
Wait, are you running the backend?
The backend is running.
Doesn't matter if the backend is inside this folder
Nah.
structure.
Nah, shouldn't. Because
I don't know. Does it? Is it? Because in the other one, you've got it in the same folder structure, and in this one, you're accessing it from a different folder.
that doesn't mean anything.
I don't know.
So,
I'm just like suspicious. Like, what if it does? Do you want to quickly like copy
oh
the
my God.
backend server
Yeah.
into that?
Wait, no, wrong folder. Oh God, this is going to be interesting.
Just like comment out the line. Oh, it should be okay. Let's copy it and then close the one you have on now.
It's gonna take a while, but sure.
Is it copied? Yep. Is it still
Oh shit, I copied it into the wrong thing. Ugh.
Oh. It's fine.
All right.
Okay, and then go into
Make a new
CD into
terminal.
you have to ls, so go out of it. Yep. And then just run so Python 3.
All right, let's see if that is running.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool. Now it's in the same
Cool.
folder structure.
Now, if I try to
Save it.
imagine if this is it, I will not. It's not.
Mm.
And this one still works. See, so it's
Yeah,
not.
yeah, it's not boring.
Interesting. Deep live debug.
Live debugging. We're showing people how to use the tool.
Mhm. But
Do you want to try commenting out that line, like what Andy
Which line?
suggested? The one that's not working, the data line or whatever. Where you, yeah, that one.
This one?
Yeah. I think that one. I don't know what that will do though. And also get this.
No, we return res. Yeah, but that no, but res is this. It's got all this information.
I don't know. Let's see.
Yeah. Why did it work the first time?
It's probably just a small bug somewhere.
Literally.
I think just use the original one and then get rid of some stuff maybe. Or comment things out in the original one and then just show it. Because we could spend hours.
I'm gonna do this.
Do you want to just comment like you're not using something right now? Just comment it out and then we'll show the future on. As you look through the workshop.
Yeah. All right. Oh God.
It's fine.
Yeah, I shouldn't do that because that's a true copy. Let me open my GitHub.
Check the.
Does that work? It still works. Wait, did you add the 1, 2, 3? Oh, I see. Yeah, I can't because I got rid of the code. Anyways. I have no clue what happened there, but let's just go off the code that I know works for sure. So basically, oh wait, let me just comment out a bit more things. So basically, every time our web page renders, it's going to call the use effects, and the use effects gets our list of recipes from the API, and sets what we have, sets this recipe state to what we got back from the API. And that looks something like this. Okay, cool. All right, so this is what it looked like before, I believe. Yeah, so this is what we should have had, and we definitely will not have the ads there. I haven't gotten to that yet, but let's just leave it there for now. So right now we have something looking like this, and as you guys have just seen, there should be a little cross icon that comes up every time we hover our mouse over something, and and when we click on it, it should delete something. And let's implement that now. So React doesn't have like any way to detect if your mouse is actually currently on the block. So instead we have to use the on mouse enter or an on mouse leave. And on mouse enter and on mouse leave, the names themselves are self-explanatory. We just want to define the behavior of set on mouse enter. So every time our mouse enters a box of ingredients, it will set hover to true. So we're setting a state hover, which we keep track of whether our mouse is hovering over the box or not. And on mouse leave, we're going to set hover to false. And and then for our cross icon, we're going to be using the React icons library. And to do that, you need to run npm install. So npm is just the package manager for Node. And if you run npm install React icons, it comes with a bunch of useful icons. I've already installed it, so I'm not going to run it again. But and the cross icon for some reason is called part-times. So we're importing that from React icons, and then whenever hover is set to true, we're going to create this cross. And we can see that it will be in line with the recipe name because because they're both in the H3 section. And here we're setting that the style of your cursor will become, instead of a normal cursor, it'll become a pointer. And let's get rid of that. And when we click it, we're going to have an on delete function that gets passed in. We don't have that defined yet, but basically this line, it basically says it tells us what should be done when on click is, or when this icon is clicked. So now if we save that, see, now that every time my mouse hovers over something, the corresponding cross icon shows up. And when my mouse is on the cross icon, it turns into the pointer, which we set to before. Cool. And let's work on the onDelete function now. So I've basically written it here, but basically it deletes a recipe from the server. And we're going to, so every time we call on, wait, where is it? Yep. Every time we call onDelete, we're going to be passing in the ID of our recipe. And when we pass in, and then when we pass in the ID, we're gonna set that to a JSON object, or an object, and then converting that to JSON to be passed in as part of the delete request. Yeah, and after we deleted something, we want to then fetch our new list of recipes from, so that basically the updated list of recipes from our API, and then setting that to be our new list of recipes. So if we save this and say, for example, let's open console as well. So if we delete fried rice here, for example, oh God, it's because I didn't pass it in. Yeah. So this onDelete function is going to get passed into our recipe list component, which then passes it into our individual recipe box component. But now if we save it, oh my God. Delete recipe, that's it. So now if we try to delete fried rice, and if we look at network, where would it be? Oh. But yeah, basically we're getting a new list from, you can see that this list is also getting updated because we're getting the new list from the database as well. Cool. So I guess now that's done, let's move on to the adding a recipe. Actually, any questions so far? It's been a bit of a mess, but.
Doing well.
Thanks. All right, let's move on to add recipe. So add recipe, well, the button's already here, but the idea is we're going to have to create a button component. You can actually import buttons from like other other packages, but here I'm just creating my own button. And for every button, we're going to pass in the color, the text, and what should happen when it gets clicked. And this way we can reuse this button component, and we don't have to write a new button component for every new button that might say something different. And here we're setting when the button is clicked, we're going to set this, going to set the color to whatever color that got passed in, and what's going to show on the button is what the text is. So we can have, so in React, we can have default props, which I guess all of these, they're props. And another way of accessing them is if you just pass in props and do props instead of color, you would do props.color, but everything here are basically props, and you can set default ones. So here, if a color doesn't get passed in, then we're going to set it as seal blue, or we can make it red, or you can also pass in the hexadecimal code for it, like something like this. And then we can also define what exact types we want every single one of these props to be. So for example, if we only want strings to be passed in, then if we set it as this and something that's not a string gets passed in, it doesn't break. Or it will throw an error. Cool. And then now that we've got the button sorted, we go into, as we can see, the add is next to our header, so we can just put it, import, well, we first have to import button because that's our new component. And then we use this button, pass in the props, so black, and on add is what is the function that's going to get called when we click on it. We'll talk a bit about that in a bit as well. And here we're also going to pass in a show add. So the idea is if I click on it, something comes, we'll see a form, and instead of add, we want it to say close instead, because we want to close the form. So we're going to pass in a variable that's a boolean called show add, and then if it's true, then we're going to close the button's going to say close instead of add. And again, this is just a benefit of the components where we can just pass in props and we don't have to make two separate buttons for two separate button components for close and add. Cool. And then in our app, we want something to so we want a form to show up when we press add that lets you type in the name, the ingredients, and the method. And to do that, I'll just grab the code. Oh, firstly, we would then need to have a component called that is going to get rendered every time we click on the ad. So this is our component. It's a form, and then it has an on submit. So something that would get triggered every time you click submit. And we would ask for an input of name, ingredients, methods, and then this is how you have an input field. So the input, we would have a type of text, and then the value will be the name. So basically we have more states for this component, and they're just name, ingredient, and method, and every time you type something, it will trigger the on change method. And when an on change sets the name to the name that you have typed. And once all that's done, we also want a submit button. Yeah, and then we also have the on submit function. So it's something that gets triggered every time we press the submit button, and if we have, and then we have a check here that checks if the name or ingredient or method is empty, and it would give you a warning. And if it's all fine, then we're going to call the on add function, which we will work on in the main function. But before that, let's just add this component in. So instead of just header, now we're going to be passing in the on-add function that we will define, which is this. And then we're also going to pass in the state show add, which is a boolean, which when this show add is set to true, we're going to show the add recipe component. Now let's save it and oh no. Yeah, add recipe is not defined. Let's just delete that for now. Now if we click on add, we get this form showing up, and that's because when we click add, this show add is getting set to true. And if show add is true, we're also going to render add recipe. So add recipe is the form that we were making before. And as I said, we can have, and if we have a field left blank, it'll check that there's a blank, it'll see that there's a blank field and tell us that we can't add this recipe. And right now, if we click, add recipe, nothing will happen because we haven't defined an on add function yet, but this is basically what our on add function would look like. So every time we add something, we want to post what we are adding into the API. So when we just want to get information from the API, we can just use a get call. But when we want to actually add information to the API, we have to use a post. And in the post, we have to specify that this is a JSON data that's going to get sent. And the body of the post will be our recipe, but passed into a JSON file. And let's get this back. Now, if we save this, and then if we click on add recipe, you can see that our new recipe is getting added. And again, with our add recipe, after we post it, we want to fetch the new content from the API as well. So, which is why we're seeing this update down here. And then, as I mentioned before, the state can control what this button says. So we have add, and when it's set to true, it will say close instead. And yeah, that's it. That should be everything, right? Cool. That is everything for the demo. As I said, all of the code is on our GitHub that you should all have access to. But I also want to point out that this is very, I guess we didn't cover a lot of content that might be required in a website in this workshop as well. So for example, routing. So instead of just having one page, we want to have multiple different pages for our website. It would look something like this. I'll just show you what like a page from my some code from my capstone project so that you guys can have an idea. But you can see that there might be different paths for the website. So for example, if you have Google and you have Google Maps and stuff like that, you can do that with the switch and route. We didn't really look into that this workshop. there's also something called a production build. So what we've been working on so far is just develop that build or test build. I don't remember what it's called, but you can't actually, so because it's not a production build, you can't actually deploy it. So, and it's quite simple to turn it into a production build. I don't remember how to do it off the top of my head. But we also didn't cover that. Error handling is another thing we didn't really cover. So basically, if we get data that we're not expecting right now, the website would just crash. But instead, what you probably want to do, so for example, when we do, for example, here, if res comes back corrupt and we can't convert it to JSON like what happened before, the website could just crash. But instead, what you might want to do is surround all these in a try block. And if any of this throws an error, then you can catch the error. For example, log it. Oh, what is that? Log it, and then so that instead of running into an error and your whole web page crashing, this way, if you run into an error, you'll just get an error message and then the whole website still works. And another thing we did not touch is security. I think Prashantha probably already told you guys how our backend is very insecure at the moment. It has, anyone can access it, basically. And that's the same with our front end. So we're not actually checking like if, for example, if someone is trying to do like an attack on the website, although there's not much data to be hacks of, but you know, if someone do attack the website, we don't have anything implemented to go against that. And also, I guess, just checking if anyone is trying to submit malicious data into the database instead of like proper data. And yeah, that's all for this workshop. Any questions? Although I do have questions myself as to why that didn't work, but yeah. Cool. I guess this is the end of the workshop, and you guys can have a go at React, and we'll be around to help answer any questions you guys have. And yeah.